name is Christine. Welcome. I do want to give you the quick warning. Yes, I am live streaming this through Zoom right now, but they can only hear me. They can't and see my presentation. They can't hear you unless you start screaming at me. And please don't do that. But welcome. My name is Christine Brin. I am an Associate Curator of Education at the Maritime Museum in Beaufort. And my favorite thing to talk about tends to be the most off-color stuff that has to do with maritime history. And that includes sea monsters and, in this case, waste management at sea and the history of it. Because it really is a very interesting aspect of the ship development over the years. And also, I like to say, it's one of the most often utilized and underappreciated pieces of technology. So before we continue with that, this is a part of the Maritime Heritage Lecture Series with the North Carolina Maritime Museum. We're very thankful that Fort Macon is allowing us to host it here while we are closed to the public. Our next presentation will be on September 25th, and it will be about the Rachel Carson Reserve and presented by the site manager of the Rachel Carson Reserve, Ben Wonderly. This is a kind of a new presentation for us, so I'm very excited to have that as part of it. So I encourage you to join us. All of our presentations are live streamed through Zoom and then recorded and posted on our YouTube page later. So if there's something you want to learn more about or review again, please feel free. Do I need to be louder? I can be totally louder if I need to be. Okay, so on to the fun. Sailors of the 18th century were just as human as the rest of us, which means that they had to sleep, eat, drink, and relieve themselves. And that, unfortunately, was a challenge. You would think a lot of people, when I have discussed the idea that this technology was evolving and definitely a challenge at sea, everyone goes, oh, just go over the side of the ship. And it wasn't that easy. And I'll be explaining about that as we go through. Because the sailors that we're dealing with, yay, technology working. To put it into context for you, many of the sailors during what would be considered the age of sail, the age of exploration on those larger ships, they're coming from these home ports, primarily using an example of England. And I want to set this kind of context for you where they're dealing at that time with a lot of the negative consequences of waste, but they have no idea that it's the negative consequences of waste. They have yet to actually connect waste with causing illness or waste-related illness. They're right now still dumping all of their waste out into the middle of their main water sources for drinking and going, oh my gosh, I don't know why I'm getting sick right now. So these men, primarily men, are coming onto the ships, having grown up in these cities, having grown up in these towns where waste management was already very poorly done, and they would see no reason on a ship to change their practices. So a lot of this waste management that was going on was you would see chamber pots being very discreetly hidden or not so discreetly hidden. You also on land would see, you would hear about people dumping their waste out of their window, and then there would be the waste management guy, the garbage man. He was in charge of picking up all refuse, not just your garbage, but also what you dumped out of your chamber pot. And he would come around with his wagon, clean all that up, and then dump all of it into their local river. And then, you know, people would get their water for drinking and go swimming in that. So our sailors are coming onto sea and they're going to try and do the same practice, which is essentially relieve themselves wherever they are. And that's not going to work for them. It doesn't work for as far as sanitation goes. I've been able, through my studies, and look at the way waste management was handled. I've found 3 different eras of waste management. And that is on ships specifically. We're going to have the no-deck period. That's the earliest period. We're looking like 13th century and before, where we have canoes and such that have no decks. They're just the hull of the boat itself. Then we have multiple decks is what I call it. And that's where we get our larger ships that we think of during the age of exploration. And then we get what I have come to call the below deck, our submarines, which come with their own added challenge. I just got a text message. Let me make sure that's not Zoom saying, we can't hear you. Nope, they can hear us. So the no-deck period, as I said, is kind of the 14th century and previous. During this time period, the boats, just because of their size being smaller, they weren't going out for extended voyages. They weren't spending days or weeks or months out on these different ships, just because they are smaller and the technology at that time was limited. So their need to relieve themselves while on those boats was limited. They're not out there for extended times. And the side and the ocean of itself was a lot more accessible than it would be on later voyages. We do know that there are quite a few discussions of them using their buckets. The bucket brigade is something that will stay consistent throughout the whole time of being on the ocean. And waste management was not just as far as urine or feces, but we're also talking about when they would become ill while they were out there, which is a very common occurrence. We would hear about, I've read stories where passengers on some of these ships were getting sick and unable to get out of bed for weeks at a time. So that waste management at that point becomes a very concerning situation. But buckets were definitely something that we see showing up consistently. Y'all up for a fun joke? We'll break it up. What do you do if you find a bear in your toilet? You let it finish. Don't chase the bear off your toilet. I got one giggle. Okay, there won't be too many of those. As ships got bigger and we started seeing more and more decks kind of coming on and more people getting onto these ships, it started to become a problem because, as I said, these men were on their ships and they were relieving themselves pretty much wherever they wanted to. They weren't being discreet about it, and it was becoming a problem. And the reason this really became a problem was because if you're up here on the top deck, as you can see, all of that waste would slowly flow down into the bilge at the bottom of their boats. Now, the sailors and the designers of these boats did recognize this was a significant problem, not because it was a health issue, but because it just stank. It was absolutely rancid. You would go down in there, the ballast that was in the bottom of the boat would just be covered in algae and bacteria. They could see it, they could smell it, they could tell this was very distasteful. It was very common for ships at the time to have to be to be careened so they could clean the bottom of the boat. A lot of times when you hear sailors or historians talk about it, they'll talk about just scraping the outside and the stuff off the outside of the boat. But at the same time, it was also very common to clean all of the ballast out of the bottom of the boat and scrub that as well because of the sheer amount of waste that would be down there. They would have their pumps that would very commonly pump everything out of the bottom as well while they're out on the ocean. Large wooden ships, as good as they are, they're always going to have leakage going on and they're going to accumulate water in the bottom and all of this waste that's coming from the sailors themselves, any passengers that they have, if they have livestock, which is very common as well, and that would all start to build up in the bottom. So what they did early on was they started building what they call scuppers and waterways into the side of the boats. And we still have those today on the deck. They're just essentially little holes on the side. That way anything that's on the deck will wash off as the waves come up. And then they also have waterways, which are essentially gutters along the side to help funnel that wastewater as well that might be on the deck. Today, fortunately, our sailors know better than to urinate on the top deck, so we don't use that for the same purposes, but it is still very much a practice today. But that was early on. The scuppers and the waterways, as these boats started getting bigger, were the way to funnel that waste out. Like I said, they did have the chamber pots of sorts or buckets, and they could dump those over the side, but it was more common. You are unfortunately still seeing a lot of sailors just relieving themselves against a wall. As time goes on, we start seeing a lot more in the way of technology development. I bet you didn't know that the compass would lead to a need for better waste management, but the invention of the compass and the adoption of it as a navigational aid, probably about the 13th century, and then charts starting to be developed of the ocean also around the 13th century, led to an age of exploration in ships. So our ships start getting bigger, more people start getting onto those ships. So before we had crews of might be anywhere from, kayaks or smaller canoes with one person in it up to maybe 50. Now we're talking people in counts of in the hundreds getting onto these ships. And instead of being on them for hours or days at a time, now they're counting months or years at a time. So this waste management problem that was already kind of an inconvenience in the earlier no-decks period, earlier 13th century and before, really starts to become a bigger concern when we get into what I've deemed the multi-deck situation. So this is when between about the 1400s and 1800s, we start seeing the ships getting bigger and bigger. And that is because, like I said, they've entered into that age of exploration. We start seeing well-known ships such as the Santa Maria or Mayflower, both of which had passengers on them, not just crews. So we're seeing more and more people jammed into these relatively small spaces. And they have to deal with how they're going to deal with this waste management, because now they've got more of it. They have passengers that don't necessarily want to just hang off the side of the ship, or might not want to relieve themselves just anywhere on the ship. So what they start doing is as these ships develop, designers start creating areas. For the first time, as we get multi-decks, they have a deck called the poop deck on the back. And I do want to be very clear, the poop deck is not where you poop. On a sailing vessel like this one, ironically, the area of the ship that shares its name with the waste product, the poop deck, has nothing to do with poop or waste. The poop deck is the highest deck at the back or stern of the ship. The name comes from the Latin word pupus, meaning the stern of a ship. Fun fact for you, the word pupus is also the name of the constellation representing the stern of the mythological Greek ship Argo. The word poop was not actually used to refer to human or animal waste until the 1900s. So it was the poop deck long before poop was poop. But do not poop on it, because if you are on a ship that is a sailing vessel, if you've ever been on a ship that is a sailing vessel, you'll think about which way the wind is blowing. It's blowing from your back to your front because it's moving your ship for you. So if you were to drop your waste on the back deck of the ship, you will be showering everybody on the ship with your waste. Not good. Where you actually want to go on the ship, if you want to relieve yourself, is going to be the very front of the ship. And this is something that started to develop during this time period as far as designers of boats, in that they started creating this more triangular front and pointed front to ships as well. This led to a lot of different advantages, one of them being that it became a very convenient place to relieve yourself. What would happen here is you would see crews, and what they would do is they would actually be able to go to the top front of the ship, and they would design it so that there was grading up here and they could relieve themselves, because the front of the ship, if you've ever seen a ship out on the ocean, is almost always hitting the waters or having waves wash over it. So this area is one that would very commonly be washed down, and very commonly the sailors would also be bathed as they attempted to clean or use the head of the ship. But to this day, if you go onto a modern vessel, especially in the Coast Guard or the Navy, they don't refer to the bathrooms as the bathrooms. They will refer to them as the head. And that is from this time period where a sailor would use the head of the ship to relieve themselves. So to this day, they continue to use that term, which is very exciting for me. If you go to Elizabeth II down in Roanoke Island, you can actually see where they've designed that head to be used. I don't believe any of the reenactors use it though, so don't let them say that I have. I already gave you the word of caution, don't use the poop deck. Now, even though the head was an option as far as where they could use the relieve themselves, sailors were still making an unfortunate habit of relieving themselves anywhere and everywhere on the ship. And this became a huge problem as the navies got bigger, as merchant ships got bigger. And we see a number of different stories showing up of very inventive sailors trying to find ways around having to use the head. And that led to some interesting regulations around it that gives us some insight into the challenges that come with this. This one is a story about a speaking trumpet. If you've not seen speaking trumpets before, this is a tool that a sailor will use to actually amplify their voice while giving commands or directions while out on the ocean. Now, there is a documented complaint from 1798 from an Aaron Thomas, who was a sailor, and he was actually had a complaint against him because the sailor that was using the speaking trumpet asked why it had such a strong smell to it. And another sailor pointed out that the reason that the speaking trumpet had a smell to it was because one or more of the sailors had been using it, and I give you this quote directly because it's great, as a pissing machine to carry his urine from his body off the quarterdeck and through one of the ports into the sea. So yes, quite a smell. And if you can imagine, they're using it in this manner, and then this poor man is having to put it up to his face to amplify his voice. Even if he does not at this point understand that illness can come from mixing that, it's still not a pleasant experience for him. There's another story from about the same time period of a group of sailors who had a complaint brought against them by the passengers on their ship. They had all become quite upset with the captain of their ship, so had taken it into their habit of going into his quarters and relieving themselves into a boat model that was in his quarters. I don't know how anything else other than they say they relieved themselves into his boat model. Apparently, the boat model became quite full of this material and started leaking below decks right on top of the passengers during their Sunday morning services. So that these stories like that, like the speaking trumpet, got up to higher ups, and in 1747 we see a number of different I want to say rules and orders coming down from the Admiralty, and one of them is a very interesting one, and it says that all necessary precautions must be used by placing proper sentinels or otherwise to prevent people from essentially relieving themselves through the grates into the hold of the ship. So the Admiralty and the higher ups are saying you need to have somebody, security, standing near every grate to make sure nobody is relieving themselves into the hold of the ship. It had become such a problem. Along with this, they started experimenting with a variety of different ways of making dedicated places for waste management or for relieving yourself beyond just the head, so that ideally we would see the sailors not having to just use the grates into the hold. One of those you can see here on this diagram of the ship, they had these platforms that they installed hanging off the side of the ship with a series of holes in it for you to sit on and relieve yourself. And that was fairly effective, but also pretty dangerous, especially if you're a female passenger in a dress. Not likely going to work out for you. It wasn't as common, but it was one of the styles that they did attempt to use. Probably the most popular and well-known was the seat of ease, and they would install these on portions of the ship. At the head of the ship was where we see it a lot, sometimes hanging off the side, and essentially those are just wooden boxes. I had to cut out the man that was sitting on the other part of that seat, but they would sit on there, relieve themselves, and it would go through the grating into the ocean, not into the hold of the ship. We do have the remains of the seat of ease from a couple different shipwrecks, but the seat of ease was less likely to be available for the common sailor and more likely to be a special treat kind of for the officers. This is a captain's quarter. This is the recreation of the captain's quarters from Mayflower 2 up in Massachusetts. Often when we talk about a captain's quarters, people tend to think of these big elaborate rooms that Hollywood has shown us, and they're actually quite small. And you would see those seat of eases be installed in here in one way, probably towards the back here. They don't have one in this one, but it would be in there. The captain was likely the only one that would get to use it, maybe a favored officer. And that would also relieve straight into the water, often with waves and ocean coming up through it. Less than ideal, but it worked. It served its purpose. For the other sailors, what you're seeing a lot of, and what was introduced probably what was introduced probably around the 1800s or the 17th century, we see is the pistale. The pistale was developed to provide a safer, more contained option for them to relieve themselves. It is a precursor to what we think of as the modern urinal, which was around, it was officially, the modern urinal was officially copyrighted in 1856, but this predates that, obviously. The urinal's been around for a while. But a lot of the ships would have these pistales installed in a series of different locations that were considered convenient for the sailors to ideally prevent them or cut back on them putting their waste everywhere. In this engraving of a ship of the third rate, you can actually see that they have 82 there, and 82 where they've marked that they would put the pistale right there. It would have the urinal and then a tube that would lead out the side of the ship and a little further away from the ship so as not to hit the sailors or the cannons that are working on the gun ports there. Another challenge to them potentially just going off the side of the ship. So these pistales would be put in a number of different locations. And one of my favorite parts about the pistale is, though largely these ships are all made of wood, when we have come by the ships that have wrecked, because our pistales were made out of metal, we've actually discovered and recovered the remains of pistales at some of our better known shipwreck sites, such as the Invincible in 1758. This one, though very nicely done, was never identified as to what shipwreck it came from. But then we do have the Henrietta Marie right there, and you can see where this tube would have been connected more to that bowl-like structure on the top and then would have let out. Same with this one that is partial, and then that's that bowl-like structure and then the tube that would lead out. So we know that this was, despite having seen other ships with different contraptions, the pistale really was the most popular option for this time period and the more common one. Numerous wrecks of the numerous wrecks of the 18th century have also still turned up chamber pots. That's something that we're going to see consistently throughout time. This chamber pot is from the Swift. It's a sloop that wrecked in 1770 off of Argentina. There they found 3 ceramic pots, but they don't believe they were actually being used because they believe that there were in excess of over 100 sailors on that ship at the time. So that would have definitely not been enough ceramic pots or for all of those sailors, but was likely that they were either trading it or they had it on their ship specifically for their officers or passengers at the time. But it was still being used. There were occurrences where the sailors or the passengers couldn't get out of their bunks for fear of weather or poor health. So still around, still being used. I like to show this one because this one comes with a very interesting story to go with it. We all understand what chamber pots are traditionally used for. These chamber pots right here were found on a shipwreck, and the archaeologists, a 1785 wreck, and the archaeologists, when they originally recovered it, pulled them out, said, oh, here's proof that sailors were using chamber pots on their ship. As they continued to study these chamber pots, they found the interesting tendency to find char marks on the outside and then utensil marks on the inside of these chamber pots, which is evidence that these sailors had actually not been using the chamber pots for their intended use, but were using them for food preparation instead. So sailors were notorious because space is limited for never using, no item had one use. They would have multiple uses, but I think this is taking it to a little extreme. I don't know if I would have repurposed my chamber pot for brining my food. The wooden bucket was also a practice. This comes from the medieval times, but we see this showing up again in some journal entries in the 17th and 18th century, where passengers, where there might be multiple of them, would have one wooden tub in the middle of their deck. And this is where they would congregate all of their waste, and then ultimately that tub would be taken up to the top deck. Very pleasant smell, I'm sure. We do have so technology did start to evolve, and there was always, as we move through the 18th century, there was this desire to kind of humanize and kind of civilize a little bit the waste management that were on the ships. And in the summer of 1834, there is a record of the Navy Board of Commissioners. They agreed that to put what they called a portable patent water closet on the the Constitution. This was designed to make it much more convenient. Specifically, they wanted to put it in the sick bay. Understandably, you have quite a few guys in that area that would be unable to get to the head or a piss tail. I want to point out, this specific model was designed by the unfortunately named Henry Philpott. So I love when they come up with good names like that. It would take them another 3 years after approving it, it would be another 3 years before the water closet was officially installed on Constitution, and it was only in the sick bay. It does appear that this was not a common practice, but might have been unique to Constitution. The flushing toilet on land would not be invented until 1596, and it would not be adopted on ships until much later. I found this great quote from a writer named Thomas Lynch, where he said, "The flush toilet, more than any single invention, has civilized us in a way that religion and law would never accomplish." Initially, I interpreted this as meaning that sailors, because of their resistance to bringing in this bit of civilization, were uncivilized. But then I had a sailor point out to me that they've had flushing toilets longer than anybody on land, because all of their toilets are self-flushing. So in theory, our pirates and sailors were civilized long before landmen were. But 1596, we see this is one of the earliest versions of what that toilet would have looked like, very different from what we are using today. And it wouldn't be until probably, I'm saying, the 1800s before we see flushing technology come to ships. And that is because we move into the next era of waste management, and that's when we go below decks. Up until this time period, up until the 1800s, we're seeing our ships being able to just utilize gravity to take waste off of their ships. Like I said, self-flushing toilets. They can just dump it over the side. But as we see ships such as the Monitor in the 1860s or 1862 with the USS Monitor being built largely below water, they had to utilize and design new technology to make it so that they could get rid of that waste. They'd already, at this point, had made I am so sorry about my phone. They had made it so that they just finally made the connection that waste was causing everybody to get sick. Oh my gosh, breakthrough. So they no longer wanted the waste to be sitting around. It also was very smelly, obviously, so they wanted to get it off the boat. And they needed to be discreet about it. So the designer of the USS Monitor actually created the first successful flushing toilet in 1862 for Monitor specifically. And it was supposedly a very, very complicated system that most of the sailors were reluctant to use because of the amount of valves and such. Since most of the ship rode below the water line, they could not rely on gravity, as I said. Swedish engineer John Ericsson addressed the issue by developing a pressurized pump system. After a sailor would use the toilet, he had to close a near valve, open a valve farther away, and then actuate a pump to drive the waste out. It was tricky to use, and the sailors at the time had an urban legend about a sailor that had misused all of the technology and been blown off of his own toilet by the pump system. Whether that's true or not, we won't ever know. But we do have, so this system continues to evolve as ships evolve more into U-boats and submarines. And we actually learn about, there is a great story about a U-boat during April 15th, 1954, and that was commanded by the unfortunately named Commander Schlitt. Commander Schlitt, according to this story, had to was in enemy waters, found himself in need of using the restroom, used the bathroom, started working the valve system, used the valves incorrectly, and so just to give you a feel. So this isn't the one from Commander Schlitt's U-boat, but that gives you a feel for just how complicated of a system he was trying to work with right there. He was trying to work the different valves, unfortunately could not work them properly, called in another sailor that was on the boat with him. Neither of them were able to get it to close correctly, and it started to fill up with seawater and wastewater. This seems like a very inconvenient situation, smelly, embarrassing, but nothing to put in the history books until the point where you take note of the design of this particular style of U-boat. And in this style of U-boat, the bathroom, which is here, is located right next to the batteries of the U-boat. And as this ocean water started filling up and leaking in, and the waste started leaking in and it got onto the batteries, there was a chemical reaction between that salt water and those batteries that then began to produce a poisonous chlorine gas that started filling up the inside of that U-boat. This forced Commander Schlitt to come up to surface. Remind you, they are in enemy waters. This is supposed to be an image of Commander Schlitt of this U-boat coming up out in dire need. They had to actually abandon ship. There they are, abandoning ship because of the misused bathroom. 46 of the 48 sailors on board did survive this incident, but they did have to live with the reputation of having been sunk by their own bathroom. And I don't think Captain Schlitt ever lived it down, because later on you still see his name showing up. As I had said earlier, first flushing toilet was 1596. It wasn't added to the ships until the 1800s. From that point on, and after we see it showing up in our submarines and being super complicated, we don't see it changing very much. They look largely the same as this. The mechanisms do start to evolve. It's not, interestingly, until the 1950s that we see the next big breakthrough on bathroom development, both on land and on sea, and that is with the creation of the toilet seat, which I'm especially appreciative of, because those metal rims did not look comfortable, nor did those wooden boxes. So we're very excited. So 1950, we see things kind of stay the same largely, and they do start adopting the more traditional appearing toilet onto ships. There are a variety of different technologies that start appearing on ships, including composting toilets as well. But flushing technology, traditional flushing technology, is largely accepted by ships today. This is our evolution of toilets from our bucket to today's. This is the modern marvel of the floating toilet. 1950 was the major breakthrough where they put a seat on the toilet. About 1980, they introduced what they call the floating toilet. I checked, Fort Macon doesn't have a floating toilet, sorry. But, oh, do you? So the floating toilet was introduced in Europe in 1980, and it was all the rage as far as designers went, because for the first time, the tanks were put behind the walls to make for easier maintenance and such, and then it was floating, so there's no pedestal underneath it, for easier for cleanup. So it was great for commercial use. Now, I'd love to show this because at the museum, we do have floating toilets. 1982 or 3, I think, is when it was technically unveiled in Europe. 1985 is when our building opened. So our building was one of the first buildings on this side of the Atlantic to have floating toilets. And Fort Macon does too, I guess. So next time you ever visit the museum or you visit the bathhouse here at Fort Macon, you'll have a better appreciation for when the toilet seat came to be, when the toilet itself came to be, and the fact that it is, in fact, not a bucket. One of the top questions I do get as a follow-up to this presentation is, how did they wipe themselves? Did they have toilet paper? I know it's not toilets. Largely, they didn't need to wipe themselves because there are stories of sailors where they write in their journals that as they would use these toilets, such as the head of the ship, they would have to keep one while you doing their business. They would have to keep one hand on the ship holding onto a line so they would not get washed off the ship with their waste. And then they would have to hold their clothes in the other hand above their heads so they would not get soaked from all the salt brine. So they were having a very bidet style situation, very fancy. So wiping wasn't necessary, but it also, there were times it did need to happen. So very popular at the time was to use corn husks. You could use old rags that were around. There's also this practice, this kind of legend of the tow rag. I haven't found any yet. I'm still looking, historical documentation that this was real. But there is an insult among British sailors where they will refer to somebody as a tow rag, a TOE rag. And what they might be referring to is a tow rag. And what that's supposed to be is a communal rag that would be tied on a rope and tied to wherever your place of relief was, and then dragged in the ocean to keep it clean. And then when you did your business and you needed to wipe, you could pull up the communal tow rag, do your business, and then drop it back into the ocean. Sounds beautiful, doesn't it? And toilet paper, though, would not come into existence till much later in the 1890s. This is also my chance to set the record straight because there is the ongoing debate specifically between my husband and myself as to the over-under on the toilet paper. I'm an over person. We did have a staff member at the museum who was an under person, and we used to have regular passive debate arguments where he would put the toilet paper on under and then I would go around and fix it all. But according to the patent, the original toilet paper roll patent, it is over, is the correct way to put toilet paper on the toilet paper roll. So I thank you for joining me today and going down this circle of toilet history. If you want to learn more about it, I highly recommend this book, Those Vulgar Tubes. But there's a lot of great information out there. You can also learn more about Commander Schlitt online as well. There's a lot more to his story. I just gave you kind of an easy bit of it. So thank you. To say things you didn't think you know. And now you're gonna, every time you go in the bathroom, you'll be like, I know why the toilet paper is that way. Or look at this floating toilet. Let me tell you, my poor husband, he has to deal with me doing that where I was like, look, they got a floating toilet. He's like, I don't care. I don't want to know. So thank you. Thank you. And I hope you can join us again in a week for Ben's program on the Rachel Carson. But I won't hold you hostage. You're welcome to ask any questions. I think we're going to put the movie on, give us about 5 minutes to clean up, and then we'll have the movie back on. Yes. Is it next week? That's the date. Yes. And then, our October 30th one, we're having to cancel. So